Hi, my name is Micah Brenner, and I'm the media technician here at Stratford School of Interaction Design and Business. Today I'm here to walk you through how to get started using the Canon T6i. First, let's get acclimated to the T6i by taking a look at the body, the lens, as well as some of the features it has to offer. Starting on the top of the camera, you'll see quite a few options that allow for customization. Let's start on the right side. Here you will find the on-off switch. On the top of the switch, you'll also notice an additional option of activating video mode. For now, let's simply turn the switch to the on position only. Beside the power switch, you'll find the mode wheel. This is your selection tool which allows you to navigate between various manual settings as well as built-in auto settings that have already been programmed for different genres of photography. On the mode wheel, you'll first see the green A mode, which is a dedicated full auto mode. This means that any scenario you're going into, the camera will do its absolute best to try and accommodate your environment and scenario. We will talk about the pros and cons of this further in depth later in this video. The next mode is auto as well. However, in this mode, your flash is deactivated. This is beneficial in many circumstances as in auto, the camera will typically panic in regards to insufficient light, and as a result, the flash will constantly be popping up, whether it truly needs it or not. Next is CA mode. This is a creative auto mode. In this mode, you will have some flexibility in regards to things like activating the flash or not, brightness adjustments, and some creative features such as background blur. We will be discussing better options for this later on in the video. In order to access the individual settings for an adjustment within these modes, simply press the Q button on the back of the camera. You'll notice that this will then highlight the setting and allow you to toggle through the various options by simply touching the screen. Next in the mode dial is portrait mode. This mode is an auto enhancement mode and will allow for smoothing skin, artificially blurring the backgrounds, and allows the camera to adjust tonality, which will help the subject stand out even more. Landscape mode. The biggest benefit in this mode is it allows the depth of field to stay equal, meaning if I'm taking a landscape photo of a beautiful mountain scene, I'm not going to have the foreground or background blurred, but rather have the entire image, wall to wall, sharp, just the way that your eye naturally takes it in. Close-up. This mode promises to assist with close-up shots of small subjects such as insects, flowers, etc. Please keep in mind that you are limited to the focal length based on which lens you're using at the time. For example, if I'm shooting the inside of a tulip bulb, I could use a proprietary macro lens such as the available Sigma 105mm. This will allow you to get right into the subject and show greater detail, whereas the kit lens, that's the 18-55, will require you to keep roughly 5 to 6 inches away from the subject before proper focusing occurs. Sports mode. This mode is actually pretty handy to use. When shooting fast movements such as football game, waves rolling into the beach, or a child playing, sports mode will allow the camera to automatically adjust the shutter speed to compensate for this movement. Without that compensation, you'll capture motion blur, as the shutter will not be able to keep up to the movement of your subject. Scene mode. Within scene mode, you can press the Q button on the back of the camera, and this will allow you to further select specific scenes such as kids, food, candlelight, night portraiture, handheld, night scene, and HDR backlight control. Keep in mind that these are all auto modes, meaning that the camera is doing its best job to accommodate the environment that you are selecting. However, as you are in control of the camera, only you can depict what is best for your needs. For instance, if I'm shooting a true portrait, I would want to consider using a more dedicated portrait lens, such as a 50mm, as this will offer better sharpness, it's better in low light, and gives far better depth of field, as we will be discussing later in this video. If I am shooting kids playing, only I know how fast they are running or moving, meaning that it would be best for me to manually put in the settings to get the best results. Again, all of this will be discussed coming up in this video. The next several modes on the mode dial, you'll notice are in a bracketed section. This is because they are manual settings, meaning that each will allow you to have far more controllability of the camera in order to best suit your subject and environment. Learning how to manually select all the best settings in order to complement your subject is going to dramatically benefit your photography and video skills. The auto modes again try their very best to do their thinking for you. However, only you know the intention, changing environment, and what your hopes are for the end product. Therefore, if you have the knowledge of how to achieve this the very first time by manually setting your camera, it will save you from photographing the same subject over and over in auto mode, simply trying to get the camera to replicate your intended vision. The manual modes are as follows. M. This is full manual mode. This allows you to change all of your settings such as shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and exposure. This is an ideal setting once you are fully acclimated with your camera and have practiced shooting throughout various scenarios, as it will allow you to fully use your camera's versatility. AV. This is aperture priority mode. Aperture is the opening on the back of the lens that faces your sensor. This allows the light to travel through. The setting is expressed through F numbers, such as f1.4 or f3.5 to 5.6, etc. On the back of the lens, there are built-in aperture blades that close as you raise these F numbers higher, meaning at f1.4, the blades are wide open and allow a maximum amount of natural light through to the sensor. A lens that starts at 3.5 has a much smaller starting point, allowing a lot less light to travel through to the sensor. The other changes that this creates in your photo is what is referred to as depth of field. You may have heard of this term, called bokeh. This is when the aperture f number is set as low as possible, and when you are photographing your subject, you will notice that the subject itself is sharp. However, as the depth of field behind the subject goes further back, it is more and more blurred. This is bokeh effect. It's a fantastic way to highlight a subject, as well as use storytelling in photos and video, and is typically the most popular used effect in portraiture. As you are changing your aperture, you will notice that the camera is automatically adjusting your shutter speed. What this is doing is calculating how much light you are allowing your sensor to receive through your aperture setting, and telling the camera that if there is insufficient light, it may require a longer or shorter shutter speed to compensate. This brings us to the next manual setting, shutter priority. Just as the name suggests, this puts the priority on your shutter speed and allows you to select how long of a time frame you require your shutter to be held open. For example, if I am photographing an athlete running track, it would require me to raise my shutter speed in order to photograph the runner without motion blur and freeze them in motion. To give you a better understanding of typical shutter speed thresholds, here are some tips of popular shutter speeds that you may run into. If I want to photograph the Milky Way or a starscape in the middle of the night, this is referred to as a long exposure, meaning I am setting the shutter speed for the shutter to be held open for a full 1 to 5 seconds or even longer. This allows the sensor to gather as much information as possible and natural light from the environment to develop a photo in darkness. If I'm photographing a stationary subject, my frame rate should be around 1/60th of a second. As the subject begins to move, depending on the speed of their movement, this will rise. A setting for a person running, for instance, could be anywhere from 1/160th all the way up to 1/250th of a second. This time frame is essential to calculating how quickly the shutter will close and gather its available light to then process and develop the image. Again, similar to aperture priority, in shutter priority, you'll once again notice that as you're adjusting your shutter speed, the aperture setting is now being automatically calculated by the camera. As discussed before, this should be something that is closely monitored in order to achieve your desired results. The last manual setting is program mode. This is a semi-auto mode that allows you to configure settings such as ISO, exposure, auto white balance, and focal points, while the camera automatically sets your shutter speed and aperture. This can be handy if you are just getting started and are dabbling in manual settings. It will allow you to trial various scenarios in different environments, however you are not in your own. I would suggest monitoring what settings the camera is automatically setting your shutter and aperture to, as this can help you identify what average numbers should it look like if you're in a particular environment. Above the mode dial, you'll find 3 buttons. These are more meant for use while you're in manual modes, as they are further customizable options to better enhance your photo and shooting experience. The first is autofocus selection. This allows the user to select one of the following selections for autofocus. Keep in mind that you can toggle through these selections either using the button on the top or simply use the touchscreen. Auto select. This means when you are focusing your camera in this mode, you have 19 autofocus points available and ready. Any subject within the bracket can be selected as a priority focus. Typically in this mode, as the camera is doing the thinking for you, it will select what is easiest for the camera, meaning that if the subject is closer to the camera, it will take priority. Manual single select. This mode allows you to choose one focal point and place that priority within your frame. Meaning, if I'm going to photograph a subject using my rule of thirds, I would be able to manually select my autofocus by simply moving it to the appropriate area. Then, upon pressing my shutter button halfway, it will put my priority where I intended it to be. This is traditionally a far more effective way to achieve your goals in framing and photography. Manual select zone autofocus. This means that you will be able to highlight a specific zone within the frame and allows more of a variable. Meaning, if I am trying to still achieve my rule of thirds, I can highlight the entire zone of that portion of the frame. This can be handy for making sure that you are focused on multiple points in that section. For example, if I am photographing a flower and I'm wanting the entire flower to be in focus and not just a specific portion of the flower, this will allow me to achieve that. The next button on the top of the camera is the ISO button. ISO in short is your camera's sensitivity to light, and as light is absolutely one of the highest priorities in photography and video, it's very important to always monitor your ISO. When going into your ISO menu, you'll notice the various options ranging from 100 to 12,800. The rule of thumb is that you keep your ISO as low as possible, as long as you are achieving your desired exposure outcome. You'll notice in the photo examples that shooting at a relatively low ISO will deliver a clear, non-grainy outcome. I was able to keep my exposure where I wanted it to be, despite the low light challenge. However, the photo is more than usable. In the next example, I've raised my ISO to an unnecessary extreme, and as a result, you'll see the deterioration of the photo, as the noise or grain is far more evident throughout the frame. When trialing the ISO settings, as mentioned before, only use what is necessary. If I'm shooting a stationary subject that is not moving, and my natural environment is offering sufficient light, there should be no reason to boost your ISO above 400 or 800 ISO. If I am shooting at sunset or inside of a home, where the light can be minimized, then the ISO may need to be appropriately adjusted to 800 through 1600. Anything requiring an ISO that exceeds these numbers will be then up to the individual scenario. Meaning, if I am shooting a concert and a little grain in the photo will not sacrifice the overall image, then no problem at all. If I am shooting a wedding and I know that there is insufficient light, however I need the photos to be extremely sharp and without grain, then I would move into using a secondary light source such as a flash. The next button beside ISO is DISP. This is your display button. It simply allows you to activate or deactivate your information display on the back of the screen. This can come in handy if I am shooting something where there is an audience and the backlight on my camera can become a distraction. Moving on. Above these buttons you'll find a toggle wheel. This is how you adjust the various settings that we have discussed, such as aperture and shutter speed. The particular mode or setting that you are in will be highlighted on the back information screen. As mentioned, after pressing Q, you will then be able to then toggle and adjust your settings with this wheel. Above the toggle wheel is your shutter button. This will play two roles. Pressing your shutter button down halfway will allow you to autofocus on the camera and confirm that everything is framed and sharp the way you've envisioned. And finally, pressing the button fully down will activate your shutter and capture the image. In the top center of the camera, you'll find your flash. This can be activated by simply pushing the button located to the left of it with the flash icon. Please keep in mind that as this is a built-in flash, it is somewhat limited to its use. It offers the same flash power no matter what environment or subject, and only one angle. Meaning, if you do need flexibility to shape your light, which in most cases is required, you may want to think about using an external flash, which are located in media surfaces and readily available. Moving on to the front of the camera. The first thing that you'll notice is the protruding lens. This is why the camera is referred to as a DSLR. This acronym stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex. The lens is one of the most important aspects of a DSLR, as this is how the subject in which you are capturing is translated through the sensor to your memory card. Using the wrong lens in an environment or genre photography will ultimately result in a poor image and not what you've envisioned at all. As we talked about in aperture priority, your lens option will allow you to not only depict on how your depth of field appears, but also how much available light you can work with. This particular lens is an 18 to 55. It's more of a walk-around lens and holds the purpose of an intermediate lens. Once you get more used to shooting and start growing your skills, as well as start finding out exactly what you are specifically shooting, then you'll begin to trial other lenses such as portrait lenses, macro lenses, and even telephoto. On the lens itself, you'll notice that located on the left-hand side, there's a switch that says AF and MF. This stands for autofocus and manual focus. The difference is essentially whether the camera is going to do the focusing on the lens for you, using its built-in autofocus points, or if you would like to manually focus the lens yourself. In most cases, you're going to want to rely on the autofocus being activated, as this will allow you to not have to think about this step, but rather focus on your more important exposure settings, framing, and enjoy the actual creative process of capturing your image. Reasons for using the manual focus would be things like fine-tuning a stationary subject or trying to highlight a specific feature of an item. Or, in video, doing things like focus pulls or transitions from sharp to blurry. Beside the lens, on the left-hand side, you'll find the release button. Pushing this in and turning the lens will allow you to detach the current lens and replace it with a different one. When remounting, simply match the white squares and twist the lens until it clicks, and you are ready to once again start shooting. Please note, while the lens is off the camera, the inner components of the camera are exposed and therefore vulnerable to things such as dust, fingerprints, liquids, etc. As the sensor in your camera is the most important part of the camera, as well as the most sensitive, be mindful and cover this area while changing your lenses as it attracts these contaminants. Moving on to the back of the camera, you'll find your menu button. Within the selection, you will find many options and be able to fully customize your shooting experience as well as perform tasks such as formatting your memory card. Prior to starting your project, make sure that you clear your memory card by formatting. This will allow you to confirm that you have the full capacity of storage available, as well as make sure that there are no older files on the card. It is important to note that once you have created any new content on the camera, formatting will permanently delete these files. Therefore, make sure that it is performed at the very start of the project or at the very end of the project after your files are fully backed up. Other useful areas of the menu settings will be things like changing your image quality for both photography and video, activating AF methods such as facial recognition, and a long list of other customizations that may be required for your project. Please make sure that you take your time to study your full menu and realize what the camera is capable of, as this can really make your project a far more pleasurable experience. The eyepiece to the right is known as the viewfinder. This is where I would always encourage you to be shooting through. As we are so accustomed to shooting through phone screens, it is hard to break that habit and use a viewfinder. However, the benefits of using your viewfinder are far greater. Shooting through the screen on the camera is possible by simply pushing the button to the right of the viewfinder, otherwise known as live view. However, doing this, you may run into issues with the reflective screen while shooting outdoors. Also, your process of even holding the camera while shooting through the screen versus using the viewfinder will cause more shakiness and create motion blur. And lastly to note, the fact that running the screen will draw dramatically more battery power, resulting in a much shorter shooting period. Shooting through the viewfinder, you will also find that you have more information showing, such as aperture settings, exposure, ISO, battery life, and even your autofocus settings, all clearly displayed. The next button is the AE lock. This means that if you push and hold this button while you are focusing on a subject, as long as you are holding it, it will lock in place the exposure settings for whatever light the camera is reading at the moment. This is quite handy in certain scenarios. For example, if I'm photographing a portrait outside and the light is constantly changing due to clouds passing in front of the sun, by simply finding that perfect light and holding this button in, I can keep my exposure the same throughout the various photos, instead of bouncing around and changing the settings each time the cloud passes by. Therefore, very useful when it comes to the user experience standpoint. The button to the right is a shortcut for you to once again select your autofocus point or zone. As I mentioned before, opening this feature will allow you to quick select a specific point or quadrant to better suit your needs of a specific focal point on the fly. Moving down, the AV/exposure button will play multiple roles depending on which mode you are currently in on the mode dial. For example, I'm currently in full manual, which means this button will allow me to use it as a shortcut and quickly bounce back and forth between my shutter speed and aperture settings. This, in combination with the toggle wheel, you can quickly achieve your desired settings and continue shooting without interruption. If I go into a different mode, such as the semi-auto program mode, this button now plays the role of exposure only. You'll notice that as you grow into your camera and become fully comfortable with button locations and settings, many of the buttons can play multiple roles depending on which mode you are in. Canon has made it very easy to make changes on the fly, as well as a great user experience throughout your shooting. The Q button, as I mentioned before, is known as Quick Control button. It allows you to access information screen and quickly maneuver through your settings directly without having to go into your menu and pan through the many options that you may not necessarily need in the middle of shooting. The WB button is known as your white balance button. This allows the camera to better assist in color compensation within your shooting environment. For example, am I shooting within a building with fluorescent lighting, or am I shooting outside on a bright sunny day? Each of these environments will offer very different color temperatures, and therefore your white balance options will compensate. For the most part, AWB, which is known as auto white balance, will do a phenomenal job depicting what your environment is, and therefore will not require you to select this on your own. However, it is good to get accustomed to what these selections look like as you trial through each of them. The button with the multiple frames shown on it is exactly that. It's a menu that allows you to select how many frames you'd like each time that you shoot. If I am shooting sports and would like to be able to focus on my subject and push and hold the shutter and get various shots to choose from, I would simply go into this option and select the continuous shooting mode. There are also options for single and continuous silent shooting, which is supposed to allow you to photograph image with a quieter shutter sound, as well as self-timer modes. The button with the circle of squares is a picture style option. This will allow you to specifically choose various filter options for creative shooting, such as standard or portrait, which offers support in alleviating shadows and better natural coloring, and landscape, which offers a more vivid coloring option. Again, auto selection in this folder is going to allow you to set it and forget it, as the camera does a great job recognizing your environment. However, there are fun modes to play with, which you are welcome to trial throughout your creative process. The AF button is a shortcut to choose your autofocus operation. One shot means that once you push the shutter halfway down in focus, your focus is now locked. If anything changes, whether it is you or the subject, you will need to refocus. As its name suggests, you only have one shot to get that moment. AI focus is an autofocus continuous mode, meaning that once you push the shutter down and focus on your subject, if you or your subject moves slightly, the camera will automatically readjust as long as you are holding that shutter halfway. It will continue to track and never locks focus. AI Servo is Canon's dedicated focus mode for moving subjects. It has the ability to track and analyze movement and focus the image based on where it predicts the subject will be moving. Typically, as this mode offers more versatility, this would be the choice option for focusing, as it will handle both stationary as well as movement. On the bottom, you'll find your playback button. Selecting this and using the left and right toggle buttons above will allow you to pan through the images that you've photographed. If you come across a selection that is not of use, simply push the trash can, and this will allow you to delete the image off of your memory card, freeing up space for future content. Once you're ready to transfer your work to your computer, simply open the memory card slot to the right, push the SD card until it clicks, then remove it carefully. You are now ready to begin your editing process. Now, although this tutorial should get you up and running using the Canon T6i, if you have any questions regarding the camera or the photography or video process, please feel free to reach out to stratford.digitalmedia@uwaterloo.ca.